Joining us now from Calgary is Michelle Rempel, the immigration critic for the Conservatives and the MP for Calgary Nose Hill. Great to see you again, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been about a month since the federal election. First, give me an update. How did it go in your riding of Nose Hill? And what are your general takeaways from the election? Then I want to talk to you about refugees.
Well, whenever you're talking about a successful election in one's riding, you have to thank your team. And I had a very strong team and very strong showing in the election. We won with 60% of the vote. And some of the takeaways that I've got from people in my riding is that they are very concerned about the economy, they're concerned about deficit spending, and they're concerned about ensuring that their jobs are sustainable into the long run. One of my favorite quotes about being at the door was, "Of course we're going to vote for you, we want to keep working." So that's something that I'll certainly keep close to my heart as we proceed with this new parliamentary session.
Well, you're the critic for immigration, and that has seized the attention of the political class in the last month as Justin Trudeau has careened towards his campaign promise of 25,000 Syrian migrants by Christmas. Now, just this week, they blinked a little bit and said they're only going to bring 10,000 migrants by Christmas. The next 15,000 will get another 2 months. What's your take on Trudeau's plan?
Well, I think during the election campaign, the Liberals on this particular issue engaged in some unfortunate one-upmanship. I think, Ezra, everyone would agree that we want to, as a country, assist in humanitarian crises, but you need to have a plan in order to do that. And sort of picking this arbitrary self-imposed political deadline with a sort of a random number without thinking about how they were going to deal with that, I think actually did a big disservice, both to Canadians who want to help in this situation, but also to refugees that we are going to be welcoming to Canada. There are many unanswered questions. The cost that they put in their platform was $250 million. Leaked documents last week showed $1.2 billion. This week it's $650 million. They haven't talked to the provinces in terms of how much they're expecting the provinces to shoulder. So, I'm concerned about ensuring that there is a plan, and will continue to keep their feet to the fire on that. I think that this is a hallmark of a lot of the things that were in the Liberal platform. There were a lot of promises and things sort of just rammed in there that really didn't have a lot of details attached to that. And I think that's what Canadians are going to be seeing as the Liberals begin to govern.
I think you're right about the cost. I think the number is going to be, it's always larger than governments predict of any stripe. But what's far more worrisome to me, besides the cost, I mean, look, get used to the word billion being thrown around a lot for the next 4 years. What concerns me is the idea of vetting 25,000 people in 25 days in Arabic, in a country where there are few government institutions or databases, where corruption is rife, and where people just say, I don't have any papers, they were blown up. That is far more worrisome to me than $1 billion. And the fact that 25,000 refugees by Christmas is now down to 10,000 refugees by Christmas, that's still 300 people per day in a vetting that normally takes close to a year. Are you concerned that even with their scaled back number of 10,000 migrants by Christmas, that they're still lowering our standards in terms of security and background checks?
Well, first of all, when we heard reports that the screening, or at least part of the screening, was going to be conducted on Canadian soil, I think that was a huge concern. I think a lot of Canadians were going, wow, so you're going to invite people to Canada and then screen them here. What happens if they don't pass that test? So I'm glad to hear that at least they've committed to having most of the screening happen overseas. What I'm going to be looking for now is whether or not people who have best practice experience in screening, what they have to say, what officials who are going to be conducting the screening have to say, what CSIS has to say. And even things, Ezra, like we heard last week that they hadn't briefed the public sector unions that are going to be conducting the training. I think it would be pretty important to have those people understand and well equipped to be able to do the job. Those are the sorts of questions that just because they had held a press conference this week doesn't mean that they've fully fleshed out their plan. I think, talking about the volume and the speed, we need to ensure that those questions continue to be asked, and it's fair and it's reasonable to ask those questions. And I'm very pleased to be able to do so.
Michelle, I take your point about wanting to hear the answers from the experts, from CSIS, wanting to know the process. But after a certain point in time, expressing your interest in what the experts have to say, asking the right questions, if you don't get a good answer, at what point do you say, we don't have a good answer? And 10,000 people in the month of December is such an insane rush. It's not as insane as 25,000, but it's still an insane rush. At what point do you say, we haven't been satisfied, and this is dangerous? At what point do you move from asking earnest questions with a smile to saying, we oppose this?
Well, I think it boils down to the fact that Canadians do want to help in this situation, but also want to be assured of the rigorousness of that screening process. So I think your question is valid. We have to ensure that the Liberals are being transparent with Canadians about the screening process to ensure that Canadians feel confident that that is happening. We'll continue to push them on that, but I think it goes to show what you can do in opposition. We've been out on this issue for several weeks now, talking about the realities of trying to bring that many people to Canada in a very short period of time without thinking about these details. And I think, again, not to belabor this point, but I think it's one to be made. This is going to be a commonality, unfortunately, with a lot of the Liberal policy, or lack thereof, that was presented in their platform. So,
but do you think we can vet 300 people a day? Because that's the pace between now and Christmas, and then again on to February. 300 people a day. Do you think it's even possible to vet that many people that quickly from a terrorist war zone with spotty records and counterfeit records and corruption? Do you even think it's possible to do it?
Well, Ezra, our government did commit at the beginning of this year to an additional 10,000 refugees. That was in January of this year. A lot of the pictures that you've seen of Syrian refugee families coming to Canada has been due in recent weeks has been due to the work that our government did to both clear the backlog. We actually cleared the backlog of refugee application processing so that we could do some of that in real time. We also deployed more resources to our set up in that area to be able to do some of the screening. So the government is actually in a relatively strong position because of the work that we did. That said, this is, to your point, a large volume of people in a very short period of time. What I'll be looking for, they said that they're going to produce a plan. I actually haven't seen details on the screening outside of the fact that they said that they're going to do it. The biometric data that they're capturing, that'll be interesting to see how they're comparing it to other international databases and what they're using that for in order to screen people out. But I think, I'll be honest with you, that's a question for the government, Ezra. It's something that they have to be accountable to Canadians on. By pushing this timeline, they have to also ensure Canadians are safe. And my job is to make sure that we're asking those questions and demanding that as this process unfolds.
Now, it's one thing to check for terrorism and violence, but it's another to check for extreme ideologies. Radical Islam, for example, people who don't think men and women are equal, people who think that Islam should be supreme over other faiths, people who don't believe in the separation of mosque and state. I'm distinguishing between people who are terrorists or terrorist supporters and people who just ideologically are very hostile to the West, people who might morally support the terrorists but not actually give them any aid. Do you think we should be screening out for extremist ideologies? I'm separating that from actual terrorism. Should we ask people if they're comfortable with a multicultural, multi-faith society where men and women are equal, where we don't stone gays to death, where Jews don't have to pay the jizya tax? Do you think we should screen for ideology?
I think that it's up to every Canadian to uphold the principles that allow our pluralism to function. The question here, we've always been a nation that welcomes people into our borders. We are a multicultural nation. That's a reality. But we function that way because of some of the high-level principles in our pluralism. And you've just stated some of them. Gender equality, tolerance and religious freedom and religious practice. And, I think that the bigger question, Ezra, and the right question as we move forward as a multicultural country outside of the refugee issue, looking to the fact that we are going to have to look to immigration as we deal with our declining workforce and an aging population, is how do we ensure that Canada's pluralism continues in the long run? And for me, it's calling things out. Like when you have, I remember that there was, I think it was in the Greater Toronto area, there was a couple of soccer teams that were playing, and a couple of girls that were on it had to self-deselect from a game because one of the teams didn't want to play against girls. There needs to be outrage when something like that happens, but there also needs to be support and recognition that we are strong as a country because of our diversity. I don't think that we should take, one way or the other. It's acknowledging Canada's pluralism, but also being smart about guarding it.
If we have two different refugee applicants, and one of them is in a niqab, the women do not believe that they are equal, the men don't believe that women are equal, they believe in Sharia law. And another family that are liberal, democratic Muslims, should we favor the liberal, democratic Muslims over the fundamentalist Muslims who believe in Sharia law? Like, should we have any preference for people who express liberal, democratic Canadian ideals?
Well, I think as a country, we've been successful in separating, religion from our state practices. We need to continue to do that. But the bigger question is, how do we ensure that, as I said earlier, principles like gender equality, like tolerance for a wide variety of practices, free speech, those sorts of things, are upheld and shared as values when folks come to Canada. And, that's a question for our broader Canadian culture as we move forward. I think we have to be very careful about making general assumptions, but we also can't shy away from tough questions when they get raised.
Last question. Are you worried about being called a racist? I mean, Ujjal Dosanjh, a Sikh man, former Premier of British Columbia, former Liberal cabinet minister, was furious with Kathleen Wynne, the Liberal Premier of Ontario, who implied that anyone who's against refugees is obviously a racist or a xenophobe. And Ujjal Dosanjh said, pardon me, that is not true. Are you worried, particularly because unlike Ujjal Dosanjh, he's a Sikh man, he's an immigrant himself, so obviously he's sort of bulletproof on that. Are you worried that the Liberals will simply label anyone who's worried about either terrorism or radical Islam? Are you worried about being called a racist?
Well, Ezra, a classic Liberal assertion is to go after the ad hominem attack, the personal attack, when a Conservative points out facts. And, I rest assured in the fact that the broad amount of Canadians, Canadians across the country want the questions with regard to security screening, how we are going to house and care for refugees to be asked. This doesn't mean that we are not compassionate, that we don't want to help. I think it's the opposite. But, to just somehow point fingers and call people names when they're asking pretty common sense questions, when we're talking about sunny ways and all of those sorts of things, I think it's actually a hallmark of a lot of some of the feedback that we get from the other parties on this. Mm-hmm. And my hope for this government is that we can work collaboratively, that they will respond to questions like this. I didn't read the exchange between Kathleen Wynne and Ujjal Dosanjh. I heard about it. That's really unfortunate, because I think that we talk about democratic deficit and having to change our electoral reform. It's that sort of stuff that actually needs to change. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I know that I'm asking fair questions. I am being reasonable, and I still have a desire to help Canadians and support our pluralism. So I know who I am, and I know who I am answering to, and those are my constituents, and that's what I'll continue to do. It doesn't matter what names I get called.
Right on. Michelle, by the way, I think it's Sunni ways, not sunny ways, when Justin Trudeau says it. Great to talk with you. I'm making a little joke. Michelle Rempel, Immigration Credit for the Conservatives. Look forward to talking to you again in the future. You got a big file, and it's a prickly one, and I wish you good luck with it. Folks, stick around. Thanks, Michelle. And we got more on the subject of refugees after the break.
We've heard you loud and clear. You can't get enough Canadian conservative news and opinion. Why not check out our blog? It's all your favorite conservative bloggers together on a page called The Megaphone. Go to therebel.media/themegaphone or click on the Megaphone menu from our main page to check it out.
Welcome back. I am delighted to be talking now with my friend Candice Malcolm, who is a fellow with Canadian Global Affairs and a columnist at the Sun Media newspapers. Candice, great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
You have been writing about the refugee issue, and you have a very interesting perspective. Tell me, I mean, you come from the conservative side of things, but you're writing thoughtfully today as the Liberals are in power. What do you think the best way forward is to deal with this troubled part of the world, and what should Canada's role be?
Well, Ezra, I think that the refugee resettlement, it's an important aspect of Canada's role in helping Syria and helping the plight of the people in and around Syria and Iraq, but it's a very small component of it. I think a lot of Canadians, they see it as our role to welcome people and to help people who want to come and restart their lives in Canada. But you have to keep in mind that we're talking about millions of people who have been displaced and removed either through the al-Assad regime in Syria. They've been in the midst of a civil war for nearly half a decade now, plus the insurgent rises of other rebel groups, including the so-called Islamic State. A lot of these people would prefer to go back and live in their homes and return to their ancestral homelands as opposed to being picked up and moved to Canada. So yeah, sure, we can help resettle a handful here and there, maybe 10,000, as Trudeau has now done an about-face, and return back to the number that Stephen Harper had pledged on the campaign trail, which was bringing 10,000 refugees to Canada. But I think that Canada has a larger role in securing the broader area and helping the millions upon millions of displaced Syrian and Iraqis and other ethnic minority groups, including Yazidis and Kurds and other tribes like Christians as well. It isn't just simply opening our doors and saying, sure, we'll spend a couple $2 billion to help a handful live happily in Canada. I think that we also need to be focusing on what we can do to secure Syria itself.
And that's the thing is 10,000, 25,000, that is a drop in the bucket of people who are displaced. I mean, millions of people displaced or having some trauma, and that's just Syria. And as you mentioned, there's Iraq. And listen, if you want to look for refugees around the world, there are plenty of other battles right now that don't have the globe's attention from which refugees stream. I think the only permanent answer is to try to help solve the problems on the ground, to fix it so they can stay home. But even if we can't do that, Canada simply cannot take every refugee in the world that wants to come here.
Right, and the ones that do get to the front of the line, Ezra, aren't necessarily the ones that are the most in need. It's the same as the folks that are streaming into Europe. The people that have the means and the ability and the money, frankly, to get themselves out of Syria, out of the refugee camps and into Europe, those aren't the ones that are the most in need. Even the people who are already secured in the UN camps, so the ones that Canada selects to resettle into Canada, we choose them from these refugee camps that are administered by the UN. Even those people, at least they're physically safe. That they might be living in not the best circumstances, living in a poor country and whatnot. But at the same time, at least they're safe. Some of the people who are in the most danger, we're talking about the Yazidi Kurds that are being surrounded by advancing Islamic State forces. Those are the people that are in the most need, and we're not talking about helping them. We're talking about helping the ones that are already at the front of the queue, sitting in a UN camp. So again, I think that when Canada's talking about what we can do to help the least well off in the situation, the ones that are at the biggest risk, the people who are at risk of genocide and war crimes at the hands of the Islamic State and the al-Assad regime, it frankly isn't the people in the refugee camp. So we can do a little bit to help those folks, bring some of them to Canada and help them have a better life. But when we're talking about the broader picture here, the refugee resettlement issue is really just a drop in the bucket.
You're right. And one of the things that's troubled me so much about the migrants rushing to Europe is it's obviously a first come, first serve. Whoever is the strongest or the most able to scheme a plan to get there. So not surprisingly, it is 3/4 male, young men who are physically able or wealthy or just able to move. It's just so obvious, a first come, first serve approach in Europe, but that's not our traditional definition of refugees. Let me put a question to you. I just asked Michelle Rempel, the conservative critic for immigration, a couple of questions, and they were really tough questions for her, and I can understand as a politician why she didn't give me a straight answer, but maybe you can give me your answer to them. I said to her, it's one thing to screen and to vet the background of would-be refugees for links to terrorism. Are you, on a police list of some sort? Are you part of a terrorist group? That's, a minimum standard to screen. But what about people who morally support terrorist groups, or people who are just radical in their approach to Islam? They believe in Sharia law. They don't believe in the separation of mosque and state. They think that Islam should be supreme over other religions. So I'm not even talking about people who are violent. I'm talking about people who don't have our Western liberal democratic tradition. I asked Michelle Rempel, should we be screening for ideology, for compatibility? I think of some of my absolute favorite Canadians, liberal Democrats like Raheel Raza or Tariq Fata. These are truly liberal Muslims who love Canada. That's a very different kind of person than I think some of the people who might be presenting. Should we be screening for that?
Absolutely, Ezra. I don't even think that that's a question. Of course, when we're talking about people who are going to be successful in Canada, we have to look at a number of things. And the refugee resettlement process, it isn't just a matter of, doing the security and background checks at the time, letting them come to Canada, and then that's the end of the story. The resettlement process is a long and costly one. Canadian government spends $1 billion a year on refugee resettlement services. So that's language training, education, job training, even sometimes housing. And I think that the compatibility issue is important. So if somebody has sympathies or affiliations or thinks positively of the so-called Islamic State, then no, they shouldn't be welcome to Canada. I think that when we're talking about 6-7 million displaced Syrians, we can be selective if we're only going to select 10,000 or 25,000 per year. I think, some people, obviously it's a civil war situation. People have different affiliations based on their religion and their tribe. Not everybody who's necessarily from one religion or one tribe has radical Islamic tendencies, and hopefully when they come to Canada and they see our peaceful, pluralistic society, that they'll decide to become more liberal and more tolerant and more open-minded to their neighbors and their fellow Canadians. But at the same time, somebody who's already ingrained with an ideology, those are certainly not the kind of people that we should be selecting. We could be choosy, Ezra. We have the luxury of time and space, physical space, to be able to select who we want to bring to Canada. And I think that the government should be selecting based on these kind of criteria.
Wow, I really appreciate your forthright answer. I wish that Michelle Rempel gets some of your courage. It is not un-Canadian to say we want refugees to be Canadian. In fact, to bring in people if there are millions of people that we could be selecting from, it would be un-Canadian for us not to choose the Liberals and the Democrats and the people who believe in the equality of men and women. I appreciate your words, Candice. Great to see you. I hope to keep in touch with you in the months ahead.
Great. Thanks for having me, Ezra.
Take care, my friend. Stay with us, folks. After the break, your viewer feedback and my thoughts on that.